Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world. I'm glad you could join us today for this deep dive into the historical architecture of American geography.
Yeah, thanks for being here. We are taking a really comprehensive systems-level look at Richard Rothstein's foundational book, The Color of Law.
And the mission for this deep dive, right off the bat, is to essentially reverse engineer the machinery of the built environment. We want you to look at the physical spaces you inhabit every single day.
Right, the width of your streets, the placement of your neighborhoods.
Exactly. The invisible lines that divide municipalities and school districts. We're going to trace exactly how all of that was engineered.
To do that, we have to confront this fascinating but really complex historical paradox. We're looking at how an entire society can build inequality directly into its everyday geography, baking it into the literal concrete and property lines, and then, over just a few generations, completely forget that it was ever designed that way.
It's incredible. The central question we're unpacking for you today is this. If the explicit, written rules of geographic segregation were dismantled decades ago, why do the structural outcomes of those rules remain so rigidly in place today?
To establish the baseline here, we have to define our terms clearly. When you drive through almost any major American city, the geographic divisions along racial and economic lines are starkly visible. And the conventional narrative we use to explain that landscape relies heavily on the concept of de facto segregation.
Right, de facto translates to in fact or in practice.
Exactly. It's the predominant cultural myth that most of us have internalized. It's the assumption that our divided cities and suburbs are just the organic, maybe tragic, but ultimately accidental result of natural market forces. We blame private prejudice or income disparities, assuming populations are divided simply because different groups have different purchasing power.
We assume it's human nature to self-segregate. The de facto framework basically treats the modern metropolitan landscape as a natural evolution of a free society.
But the documentation we are examining today fundamentally challenges that entire framework. The central thesis of the source material is that our geography is not de facto, but rather the highly calibrated result of de jure segregation.
De jure meaning by law.
Yes, by law. We are analyzing a history of explicit, state-sponsored, unhidden public policy. The division of our cities was not an accidental byproduct of private choices. It was a deliberate, engineered blueprint.
And the distinction between those two terms is the absolute crux of this entire analysis. Because look, if residential segregation is just de facto, if it stems from millions of private choices, then there is very little the government can, or frankly constitutionally should, do to reverse it.
It just gets treated as an unfortunate sociological reality. But if it is de jure, if local, state, and federal governments actively engineered the separation, then it represents a direct systemic violation of the United States Constitution, specifically the 5th, 13th, and 14th Amendments.
And we should clarify, this was not just a phenomenon of southern states operating under Jim Crow laws.
Not at all. This was a comprehensive, nationwide project driven heavily by the federal government, executed across the North, the Midwest, and the West.
Before we start mapping these mechanisms, we need to establish a crucial parameter for you, the listener. This deep dive is strictly a structural, institutional analysis. When you look at the historical record, it becomes immediately apparent that this machinery was constructed in a deeply bipartisan manner.
Yeah, over many decades.
Championed by liberal New Deal Democrats like FDR, and equally expanded by conservative Republicans like Herbert Hoover, Eisenhower, and Nixon. So the objective today is not to assign moral blame or take a political side. On this show, identity is understood through systems.
We're simply taking the factual record provided by the source material and using it to understand the institutional constraints that designed our current reality. So taking that systems-level approach, we have to identify the primary system that drafted the blueprint for this separation.
We're not talking about a single piece of legislation here.
No, we're looking at a highly coordinated architecture. It synchronized seemingly disparate, neutral institutions into one singular mechanism of exclusion. It utilized local zoning ordinances, public housing rules, federal housing finance, and local municipal enforcement. To understand how they synced up, we should start with early 20th century public housing.
Which is a perfect starting point because our modern perception of public housing is completely disconnected from its original design. Today, when you hear public housing, you almost universally picture underfunded, high-rise towers in city centers, designed exclusively as a safety net for deeply impoverished populations.
But the historical record shows that wasn't the original function at all. That modern perception is actually a downstream outcome of the policies we're going to discuss. When the federal government first began constructing public housing during the New Deal era of the 1930s, it was designed primarily for the working class and the middle class.
Because during the Great Depression and later during the World War II mobilization, the country faced severe housing shortages.
Exactly. You had families with steady employment who could afford decent housing, but the private market just wasn't producing it. So the federal government stepped in to build housing for these implode populations. And structurally, these early projects were heavily designated for white families.
Let's look at the administration of these programs. Specifically, Harold Ickes, FDR's Secretary of the Interior. He directed the Public Works Administration, the PWA, which built the first civilian public housing. Now, historically, Ickes was considered quite progressive on racial matters. He'd been the president of the Chicago NAACP in the 1920s.
Right.
But when we look at the structural implementation under his authority, it's a very different picture. The PWA constructed 47 housing projects. Of those, 17 were assigned exclusively to African Americans. 6 were segregated by individual buildings within a complex. And the remaining 24 projects were designated exclusively for white families.
The administrative mechanism Ickes used to justify this was called the neighborhood composition rule. The stated logic was that federal housing projects shouldn't alter the existing demographic makeup of a community. So projects built in predominantly white neighborhoods would be exclusively white, and those in black neighborhoods exclusively black.
Which, on the surface, sounds like it's just preserving a de facto status quo. It sounds passive. But when you apply a systems analysis to the actual geography of American cities in the 1930s, the neighborhood composition rule operated very differently in practice.
Because the baseline assumption that American cities were already rigidly segregated into monolithic racial blocks was historically inaccurate. Prior to these massive federal interventions, many urban neighborhoods were remarkably integrated.
Due to functional constraints, right.
Exactly. Working-class populations needed to live close to the downtown factories, rail yards, and ports where they worked. Commuter suburbs didn't exist yet. People had to walk or take short streetcar rides. So you had first-generation European immigrant families and African-American families occupying the exact same urban neighborhoods, often living on the same blocks.
So when you apply the PWA's neighborhood composition rule to those organically integrated neighborhoods, the federal government essentially evaluated them, arbitrarily classified them as officially white or colored, and then deployed federal resources to build segregated projects that enforced that new artificial designation. They actively dismantled existing integration.
They systematically imposed rigid de jure segregation. We can look at an administrative example from Miami. The government was negotiating the placement of housing for African Americans. A prominent Miami civic leader communicated directly with federal administrators, explicitly explaining that the chosen sites were deliberately selected to remove the entire colored population from areas the city planners wished to reserve for white occupancy.
And the federal government agreed to fund it based on that explicit objective of geographic removal.
Yes. And this state-sponsored geographic sorting accelerated rapidly during World War II. Industrial centers needed huge influxes of labor to build ships and munitions. Congress passed the Lanham Act to finance defense housing.
The source material traces the migration of a worker named Frank Stevenson, who relocated to Richmond, California to work in the shipyards. When these workers arrived, the federal government provided war housing but strictly enforced segregation. In many of these areas, particularly on the West Coast, the African American population had been incredibly small before the war.
So the federal government's wartime housing policy effectively introduced and cemented residential segregation in regions where it had barely even existed before. But the most transformative phase of this architecture happened when the government turned its attention to the private housing market. That brings us to the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, and risk maps.
This is the mechanism that completely re-engineered the spatial and economic reality of the American middle class. The context here is the devastation of the Great Depression. The private housing market had collapsed. To stimulate the economy, the government sought to dramatically increase homeownership. They initially created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC, to rescue defaulted mortgages.
But to execute a national bailout, they needed a systematic method for evaluating the financial risk of every single neighborhood in the country. The mechanism the HOLC developed was a series of color-coded residential security maps. They mapped every major metropolitan area, assigning one of 4 grades to every neighborhood.
The highest grade, the safest investments, was colored green. The lowest grade, deemed too hazardous for lending, was colored red, which is the origin of the term redlining.
Right. And the defining variable that downgraded a neighborhood to a red classification was not necessarily the income or creditworthiness of its residents, it was race. The mere presence of African Americans, or even proximity to an African American neighborhood, was sufficient for the federal government to officially designate an area as an uninsurable financial hazard.
The source material provides a really revealing comparison from St. Louis. The HOLC evaluated Ladue, a thriving middle-class suburban area. They gave it a green A rating, explicitly noting in official documents that it was highly desirable because it had not a single foreigner or Negro.
Then they evaluated Lincoln Terrace, also a solidly middle-class neighborhood, single-family homes, employed professionals. But the government colored Lincoln Terrace red. The documented justification for declaring this stable neighborhood a financial risk was simply that it possessed a colored element. The federal government formally embedded the premise that African Americans were inherent financial liabilities right into the foundation of real estate finance.
These maps dictated the flow of capital. The FHA adopted these mapping principles to determine which private mortgages it would insure. And to understand how strictly this design requirement was enforced, we can look at an anchor example from Detroit in 1941.
Yeah, this is a perfect proof of mechanism. A private developer was planning a new subdivision exclusively for white buyers. He applied to the FHA for mortgage insurance to get construction financing. The FHA sent appraisers to the site, and they denied the application. Why? Because the proposed white subdivision was situated too close to an existing African American neighborhood.
They determined the proximity created an unacceptable risk that the neighborhoods might integrate, which they believed would destroy property values. So the solution the developer devised to secure the federal funding perfectly illustrates de jure design.
He built a wall.
Literally, a physical concrete wall, a half-mile long, 6 feet high, and 1 foot thick, built for the sole purpose of separating his planned white subdivision from the black neighborhood.
And once the SHA inspectors verified that the concrete barrier was in place, isolating the populations, the agency approved the mortgage insurance. The federal government demanded physical infrastructure to enforce segregation as a prerequisite for access to capital.
When you look at the physical remnants of that wall in Detroit today, you are looking at the literal manifestation of state policy, which leads us to the second major phase of our analysis, the architecture of compliance. How did the state incentivize vast networks of private institutions to execute this blueprint on a continental scale?
Well, the government couldn't build millions of suburban homes itself. It needed the private sector. The primary lever they used was transforming federal underwriting. To appreciate this lever, you have to understand how hostile the private mortgage market was before the FHA.
Purchasing a home was mostly for the wealthy. A typical bank mortgage might require 50% down. The term was short, maybe 5 to 7 years, and it was interest only.
Meaning, you accumulated no equity and had to pay off the entire principal in a massive balloon payment at the end. If you couldn't, you lost the house. The FHA revolutionized this by introducing the fully amortized mortgage. Because the federal government promised to repay the bank if the borrower defaulted, banks suddenly felt secure offering 20 or 30-year mortgages,
where the monthly payment gradually paid down the principal, allowing the homeowner to build equity. Down payments dropped to 20%, and later, through VA loans for returning soldiers, 0%. This innovation created the wealth-generating engine for the working class.
But commercial banks are risk-averse. They would never have extended these terms without the absolute guarantee of federal insurance, and the government attached non-negotiable conditions to that insurance, codified in the FHA's underwriting manual. The 1935 manual explicitly stated that for a neighborhood to maintain stability, properties shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes.
The language is unambiguous. It warned that the infiltration of inharmonious racial or nationality groups would reduce property values. It even gave guidelines on evaluating physical barriers, like highways, to prevent this infiltration.
The incentive structure was absolute. If a bank financed a home in a segregated white neighborhood, the federal government rewarded the bank by absorbing all the risk. If a bank attempted to finance a home for a black family in that same neighborhood, the government actively punished the bank by denying the insurance, forcing the bank to hold the risk entirely on its own.
Segregation was engineered to be the only rational, profitable behavior for private lenders. And this extended to the mass production developers building the new suburbs. Builders like David Bohannon, who developed Rollingwood, Charles Vatterott in St. Anne, or the Levitt family, who built the Levittown developments.
To operate at that assembly line scale, building dozens of houses a day, they needed massive capital. They had to get pre-approval from the FHA for construction loans. The FHA guaranteed the loans, but only on the condition that the developer legally guarantee the absolute segregation of the future community.
The developer had to insert a racially restrictive covenant into the deed of every single property before the FHA would release the funding.
Right. A restrictive covenant is a binding clause in the deed dictating what future owners can do with the land. The FHA demanded language stating the property could never be sold, leased, or rented to anyone not of the Caucasian race. The FHA's subsidization of the American suburb was explicitly conditional upon the rigorous legal exclusion of non-white citizens.
And the system was incredibly adaptable. When one legal mechanism faced friction, the architecture just shapeshifted. We see this with local zoning laws. In 1917, the Supreme Court ruled in Buchanan v. Worley. Cities like Baltimore and Louisville had explicit racial zoning ordinances designating city blocks solely for white or black residents.
The Supreme Court struck those down, not based on equal protection, but based on the property rights of the white seller to dispose of their asset to whoever they chose. The practical effect was municipalities could no longer use explicit racial language in their zoning codes.
But the institutional desire to segregate didn't evaporate. The key figure here was Herbert Hoover, serving as Secretary of Commerce in the 1920s. He championed a new workaround: exclusionary economic zoning.
The brilliance of economic zoning, systemically speaking, is that it appears entirely race-neutral. It operates under the guise of protecting property values and managing density. It involves municipality banning multifamily dwellings, apartments, and industrial complexes from residential areas. The code reserves areas exclusively for single-family homes, mandating large minimum lot sizes.
When you look at the records of the advisory committees Hoover assembled, including individuals like Frederick Ecker of MetLife, the explicit intention was to use economic requirements as a proxy for racial exclusion.
Because African Americans had been systematically denied access to the wealth generation of the broader economy, specifically denied access to FHA amortized mortgages, banning affordable multifamily housing, effectively banned the black population from accessing those municipalities. It achieved the exact same separation as racial zoning, but insulated behind a facade of neutral municipal planning.
Having mapped this design and the incentives, we arrive at Section 3 of our systems analysis: the predictable engine of disadvantage. When you apply these rules across a society for decades, the economic disparities are mathematically predictable. We are looking at the simultaneous state-sponsored creation of the modern white middle class and the deliberate structural exclusion of African Americans from that exact same wealth-generating engine.
The scale of this operation was staggering. The federal government executed a massive subsidization campaign to persuade white working-class families to migrate out of urban centers into single-family suburban homes.
To grasp the magnitude, let's run the financial math, detailed in the source material. Working-class white families were subsidized to buy newly constructed homes in FHA-approved suburbs. In today's inflation-adjusted dollars, the cost was the equivalent of roughly $75,000.
And because of those FHA and VA mortgage structures, they acquired these assets with little to no down payment. Low-interest loans where their monthly mortgage was often less than what they'd been paying for rent in urban apartments.
A newly built home for $75,000 in today's money, zero down, backed by the government. Over the decades, the value of those homes appreciated exponentially. Families accumulated massive generational equity to finance education, weather medical emergencies, and pass on wealth.
Now contrast that with the population intentionally locked out. Let's return to Frank Stevenson, the worker in Richmond, California. He worked at a Ford Motor Company assembly plant. In the 1950s, Ford moved its operations from urban Richmond to the new FHA-financed suburb of Milpitas, 50 miles away. The white union members just used their federal mortgage privileges to buy homes near the new plant. Frank Stevenson attempted to do the same.
But the developers in Milpitas, dependent on FHA financing, were bound by those racially restrictive covenants. They refused to sell to African Americans. The local government of Milpitas actively colluded. When a union-backed initiative tried to build integrated housing, the town council suddenly increased sewer connection fees by an exorbitant amount and rezoned the land for industrial use, killing the project.
Frank Stevenson could not follow his job to the suburbs. He was denied access to the subsidized $75,000 home. He was denied the foundation of suburban wealth generation.
This systemic exclusion forced the African American population into a secondary predatory housing market. This geographic containment directly engineered concentrated disadvantage in urban centers. Denied conventional bank financing, they were restricted to a constrained supply of rentals or forced to buy older homes through exploitative instruments called contract sales.
A contract sale is a vital mechanism to understand. It's not a mortgage. The buyer makes a monthly payment to a speculator who holds the actual deed. The buyer accumulates absolutely no equity. And if the buyer misses even a single payment, they are immediately evicted. The speculator keeps the property and all previous payments, then flips it to the next desperate buyer.
Because redlining artificially restricted the supply of housing available to African Americans, demand skyrocketed within those confined boundaries, allowing speculators to charge heavily inflated prices for these contracts.
The structural outcome was devastating. Paying significantly higher effective costs for inferior housing left families with virtually no discretionary income for maintenance. To meet the exorbitant payments, families had to subdivide their homes and take in boarders, causing severe overcrowding.
The lack of capital, combined with extreme density, inevitably led to physical deterioration. The resulting slum conditions weren't a manifestation of cultural failure, they were the mathematical certainty of trapping a population in a predatory geographic enclosure.
And once that containment was solidified, other systems layered their own structural disadvantages on top of the map. Look at downstream effects, like infrastructure. The source material highlights Sugar Hill, a neighborhood in Los Angeles. In the 1940s, it was a highly affluent black neighborhood. Doctors, lawyers, celebrities like Hattie McDaniel lived there.
White neighborhood associations tried to use restrictive covenants to forcefully evict the residents. But the residents mounted a legal defense, and a state judge actually ruled in their favor, saying the covenants violated the Constitution. So private legal mechanisms failed to dislodge the community.
When private action failed, state action intervened. The Los Angeles City Council stepped in and aggressively rezoned the affluent, single-family neighborhood for high-density, multifamily rentals, a deliberate strategy to degrade property values. But the ultimate destruction was achieved through transportation infrastructure. When the state planned the Santa Monica Freeway, they deliberately routed it straight through the heart of Sugar Hill.
Utilizing eminent domain to bulldoze a thriving black neighborhood to facilitate the commutes of white suburbanites. And the routing of the interstate highway system during the 50s and 60s was frequently used as an instrument of urban renewal in this exact way.
We see similarly strategic use of geographic containment with public schools. In areas trying to maintain segregation, municipal governments and school boards would deliberately select sites for new schools designated for black children deep inside red-line neighborhoods. Concurrently, they refused to provide transportation for black students living in integrated areas.
The systemic logic was brutal. If an African American family valued their child's education, the state forced them to geographically relocate into the designated segregated zone just to access the school building. The school was an institutional weapon to draw populations into enclosures.
This exhaustive history brings us to a pivotal analytical juncture, the concept of persistence and the illusions of erasure. A listener might logically raise an objection here. They might say, the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. Redlining is illegal. Covenants are unenforceable. If the explicit de jure rules are gone, why does the geographic segregation remain so entrenched today?
To answer that, we utilize the concept of path dependence. Historical decisions constrain future trajectories. The 1968 Fair Housing Act was a monumental achievement, but it was fundamentally forward-looking. It prohibited future discrimination. It did absolutely nothing to alter the economic unaffordability that 30 years of state-sponsored wealth engineering had created.
We have to run the financial math again to see the lock-in effect. Remember those working-class white families subsidized to buy homes for the equivalent of $75,000 with zero down? Today, the descendants of those buyers still benefit. The property's appreciated. A standard home in those exact suburbs might cost $350,000 or $500,000 today.
And the revolutionary FHA zero-down terms are largely gone. To access that neighborhood today, you'd typically need a 20% down payment. 20% of a $350,000 home is $70,000 in cash required up front, just for entry.
The descendants of the white families who received the subsidy possess the inherited generational wealth to afford that. The descendants of Frank Stevenson, explicitly barred from acquiring that initial asset, are mathematically locked out. When you apply a perfectly colorblind, forward-looking law to a fundamentally unequal engineered baseline, the law doesn't dismantle the barrier, it preserves it.
It freezes the engineered inequality permanently in place. And this persistence is heavily reinforced by modern, purportedly race-neutral policies that carry a severe, disparate impact. The source material analyzes modern affordable housing programs, specifically the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, or LIHTC, and Section 8 vouchers.
Ostensibly designed to assist low-income families. But structurally, where is this housing permitted to be built? Overwhelmingly, developers use these tax credits to construct apartment complexes within already highly segregated, deeply under-resourced urban neighborhoods.
Land acquisition costs are lower there, but more importantly, predominantly white, middle-class suburbs utilize those exact same exclusionary economic zoning laws we discussed earlier, banning multifamily units, mandating large lots to legally block affordable housing from crossing their borders.
The text highlights a 2008 Supreme Court case involving the Inclusive Communities Project, or ICP, in Dallas. The ICP sued the Texas State Housing Agency, presenting data that 85% of all family tax credit units were being concentrated into highly segregated minority neighborhoods in Dallas. Meanwhile, the state was actively denying applications to place affordable developments in the affluent, predominantly white suburbs.
The implementation of the race-neutral tax credit was operating as a mechanism to supercharge ongoing segregation. Yet, despite the overwhelming volume of documented evidence proving the state's role, we suffer from a profound society-wide institutional memory loss. We've collectively forgotten the de jure blueprint.
And that erasure is actively maintained through our educational systems. The text analyzes a widely distributed high school textbook called The Americans. It praises the creation of the HOLC and the FHA during the New Deal, framing them as heroic interventions that saved homeownership.
But it completely omits the operational mechanisms. It fails to mention the HOLC invented racial color coding. It omits that the FHA conditioned mortgages on restrictive covenants. When it addresses demographic divisions of northern cities, it resorts to the passive voice, stating that de facto segregation was a fact of life.
Characterizing an engineered multi-billion-dollar federal project as a mere fact of life is an incredible distortion. But this memory loss has been elevated and codified by the highest legal authority in the country. This brings us to the Supreme Court myth.
The source material extensively documents how Supreme Court majorities have actively embedded the myth of de facto segregation into American jurisprudence. A pivotal turning point was a 1974 case, Milliken v. Bradley, dealing with the desegregation of Detroit's public schools.
The civil rights plaintiffs presented a systems-level argument. They demonstrated the government had deliberately engineered the geographic segregation of Detroit, pushing white families to the suburbs and confining black families to the city. Therefore, any constitutional remedy to integrate schools had to include the suburban districts because those boundaries were products of unconstitutional state action.
The trial judge agreed with the historical evidence. But when the case reached the Supreme Court, Justice Potter Stewart, writing for the 5-4 majority, completely rejected the evidence of state engineering. He authored an opinion claiming the concentration of African-American students in the inner city was caused by unknown and perhaps unknowable factors or cumulative acts of private racial fears.
He legally declared there was no substantive record showing government activity caused the divide. That judicial declaration was willfully blind to the massive historical record. They ignored the FHA redlining, the federally mandated covenants, and the local exclusionary zoning that built the very suburbs they were protecting.
And this judicial blindness perpetuates into the modern era. The text highlights a 2007 case, parents involved dealing with school districts in Seattle and Louisville that were voluntarily attempting to maintain racial integration. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the controlling opinion, asserting that racially separate neighborhoods were merely the product of diffuse societal discrimination and private choices.
He established the legal premise that because the segregated landscape was the result of private action, it didn't possess constitutional implications. Therefore, he ruled the local school districts were constitutionally prohibited from taking proactive, race-conscious steps to voluntarily integrate.
By legally categorizing an intensely engineered landscape as the innocent byproduct of private choices, the Supreme Court majorities absolved the government of its constitutional obligation to remedy the system it built. The logic is completely circular. If the state declares the system is an accident, the state no longer bears the responsibility to fix it.
Which moves us into a critical phase of our systems-level analysis, mapping the interconnections. We need to trace how this historical architecture adapts and constantly reinforces itself across multiple institutions today. Let's map the central feedback loop governing American social mobility.
It begins with the initial condition. State policy actively engineers segregated geography. Because local municipalities rely heavily on property taxes for revenue, your geographic housing location directly determines your local property tax base.
That local tax base dictates the funding levels and quality of your local public schools. The quality of your education heavily influences your future earning potential and wealth generation. Your adult income then dictates which neighborhoods you can afford to access in the real estate market.
Depositing you right back at the beginning of the loop, locking the next generation to the exact same trajectory. And there are specific institutional enforcement mechanisms injecting energy into this loop. Let's look at a reinforcement loop operating within finance and insurance.
The Internal Revenue Service is rarely the first agency that comes to mind here, but the text highlights their profound systemic role. The IRS wielded regulatory power by granting and maintaining the tax-exempt status of institutions aggressively enforcing geographic segregation.
The University of Chicago is a prime case study. During the 1930s and 40s, operating as a tax-exempt educational institution, they allocated massive financial resources, $100,000 between 1933 and 1947, a fortune during the Depression to fund local neighborhood associations.
The documented purpose of funding those associations was to track demographics, file lawsuits, and actively evict African American families attempting to move into the neighborhoods surrounding the university. The president of the university publicly justified this to stabilize the area for white faculty. Throughout this campaign, the IRS maintained the university's tax-exempt status, effectively providing a federal tax subsidy for the enforcement of segregation.
The financial reinforcement loop becomes even more visible and significantly more destructive when we analyze the subprime mortgage crisis that led to the 2008 collapse. The popular narrative frames it as greedy Wall Street banks and irresponsible consumers, but the text reveals a highly targeted, deeply racialized system of wealth extraction.
The crisis didn't hit geography evenly. Lenders aggressively and systematically targeted minority neighborhoods. Because these areas had been artificially starved of capital through decades of redlining and disinvestment, the populations were desperately seeking credit. Predatory lenders recognized this manufactured vulnerability and saturated the neighborhoods with toxic, subprime refinance loans.
The statistics demonstrate the precision. In Buffalo, New York, an astonishing 3/4 of all refinanced loans issued to African-American homeowners were subprime. In Chicago, borrowers in predominantly black neighborhoods were 4 times as likely to be placed into subprime loans as borrowers in white neighborhoods, even with comparable credit profiles.
We have to understand the regulatory mechanism permitting this. Banking regulators allowed yield spread premiums, or YSPs. A YSP functioned essentially as a legal kickback, a massive cash bonus paid directly by the bank to a mortgage broker for intentionally steering a borrower into a higher interest loan than they qualified for.
So an African-American family with a credit score for a standard 5% prime mortgage would be systematically pushed into an explosive 8% subprime loan just so the broker could harvest the kickback. Regulations permitted brokers to weaponize the accumulated desperation of the geographic enclosure. When the bubble burst, the foreclosures wiped out what minimal generational equity those communities had managed to scrape together.
Wealth extraction executing with mathematical precision. Now let's look at a second reinforcement loop operating through local governance. How local political power functions as an immune response to the threat of integration. The text provides a defining case study from Blackjack, Missouri.
Blackjack perfectly illustrates the weaponization of local zoning power. In 1969, this unincorporated area of St. Louis County was entirely white. A nonprofit sponsored by a Methodist church proposed building a federally subsidized housing complex for moderate-income families, explicitly aiming to create an integrated community.
The response from the white residents wasn't just vocal opposition or private flight, it was a surgical use of municipal power. They rapidly mobilized and legally incorporated the area into an independent municipality, the new city of Blackjack.
The heavily documented motivation for this incorporation was purely to acquire the legal authority to pass a highly specific zoning ordinance. Immediately upon incorporation, the City Council passed an ordinance prohibiting future construction of any residential development housing more than 3 families per acre.
The ordinance was mathematically calibrated to make the proposed integrated apartment complex illegal to build. a masterclass in race-neutral exclusionary zoning, achieving explicit racial segregation. The sponsors of the housing project filed a civil rights lawsuit.
And after years of litigation, a federal appeals court finally ruled the incorporation and ordinance were entirely motivated by racial hostility, classifying it as state action designed to confine the African American population. But the ruling reveals the tragedy of the feedback loop.
Right, because by the time the church group won 5 years later, macroeconomic conditions had shifted. Interest rates skyrocketed, federal subsidies were no longer viable, the initial financing evaporated, the project was dead. The local government didn't need to win the legal argument. They only needed the power of municipal delay to kill the integration effort.
As we synthesize the depth of this architecture, we arrive at the critical analytical question that defines our show. I'm going to ask you the core question explicitly. What is the crisis in perception here?
Breaking it down analytically using our framework, we start with what is misperceived. As a society, we widely perceive the residential segregation of our metropolitan areas as an accidental phenomenon. We perceive it as a byproduct of natural market forces, private prejudice, or personal preference. We fundamentally believe our geography is de facto.
And what is the structural layer that this perception obscures?
What remains entirely hidden from our everyday view is the intentional, highly coordinated state policy and incentive design operating across multiple institutions over a century. We fail to see the FHA underwriting manuals, the PWA neighborhood composition rules, the IRS tax exemptions, the weaponized local zoning boards, and the systemic wealth extraction of the mortgage markets. We are blind to the de jure blueprint.
Why does relying on that surface interpretation fail us?
When we evaluate society using only that surface perception, we misdiagnose the root causes of our most profound challenges. We treat massive structural outcomes like the staggering racial wealth gap, underfunded inner-city schools, or neighborhood decay as the result of individual behavior or cultural deficits. We blame the individuals trapped within the system. We completely fail to recognize the rigid mathematical system constraints that engineered those exact outcomes.
Finally, how does applying this systems analysis change our visibility?
By rigorously mapping the system, we make the invisible historical architecture visible. We see the coordinated design spanning federal and local levels. We understand the path-dependent lock-in of generational wealth. And we recognize the interlocking feedback loops compounding across generations. It proves that our daily geography is not a natural landscape that evolved organically. It is a highly regulated, purposely built environment.
A purposely built environment. That reorients everything. As we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to examine as you navigate your own world. Tomorrow, when you step outside your door, I want you to truly look at your own neighborhood. Look at the width of the streets. Observe the density of the houses. Notice the presence or the absolute legal absence of apartment buildings or duplexes. Calculate the physical distance from your block to the nearest interstate highway. If the very physical layout of our daily lives was systematically engineered to divide populations, to legally allocate generational wealth to some while actively extracting it from others, how much of your own internal understanding of concepts like merit, success, and community is actually just a psychological reflection of the zoning laws you happen to inherit? Are you simply successful, or did you just inherit a structurally favorable zone?
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.